If you've ever felt judged before anyone truly saw you, this story will hit deep. Before we begin, drop a comment if you've ever faced a moment where you had to prove who you really are, and don't forget to like this video so others can be moved by Jaden's journey too. Jaden Clark never quite fit the mold that Brighton Falls tried to shape for young men like him. Nestled in the industrial haze just outside of Chicago, the town was a place where factory horns marked the beginning of days that ended with news of arrests, evictions, or worse. Jaden's mother, Lucille, worked long shifts as a nurse, and every night she returned home with cracked hands and a smile too tired to be real. Jaden was the kind of boy who sat quietly in class, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned early on that speaking up only drew suspicion. He was 16 when he found the town library's back corner, a place so forgotten that even the dust had settled into silence. There he met the law. It was in the fine print of forgotten legal textbooks, in the handwritten margin notes of someone long gone, that he began to see a path no one else imagined for him. He copied pages into notebooks by hand, hiding them under his mattress like contraband. But no amount of knowledge could prepare him for the day a routine walk home from work ended in cold steel cuffs and a courtroom that didn't bother to ask his name before deciding who he was. The arrest had come out of nowhere, sharp as a slap and just as humiliating. A man matching his description had been spotted fleeing the scene of a break-in, and that was all it took. No evidence, no questions. Just assumptions sealed by his skin and the hoodie he wore to stay warm. He'd been walking home from the late shift at the grocery store when the squad car pulled up. Hands behind his back. Face against the hood. His mother's voice cracking over the phone at midnight, begging for someone to explain. At the station, the public defender assigned to him barely glanced at the file before advising a plea deal. Better to take a few months than risk years, he said. Jaden sat in silence. Not because he agreed, but because rage had a way of turning into quiet when the world refused to listen. He knew the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to. The worst part wasn't the cell or the stairs or even the weight of the accusation. It was knowing that this was what everyone had expected from him all along. They didn't see the boy who read case law by flashlight or the teenager who helped his mom study for her nursing exams. They saw a profile, a pattern, and they moved to dispose of him accordingly. His arraignment came quickly, as if the court couldn't wait to be done with him. The judge, Meredith Lang, sat high on the bench, her voice sharp and unsympathetic. She looked at Jaden like she had seen his kind too many times to be surprised. "Young man, you're not fooling anyone," she said with a sigh before the hearing even began. Jaden met her eyes, not with defiance but with a strange, unsettling calm. In his pocket, folded tightly, was a letter he had written to the court, a formal request to represent himself. He knew it would be laughed at, maybe even denied outright, but he had read every law surrounding his case. Every procedural error. Every precedent. And more than anything, he knew he had to try. Because if no one else would fight for him, he would. He had spent years preparing for a moment he didn't know would come. He just didn't expect it to arrive in shackles. Stay with us, because what happens next will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about strength, justice, and what it really means to rise. Make sure to stay with us. The next moment in Jaden's journey will leave you speechless. And while you're here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. The holding cell was colder than it should have been, but Jaden had stopped noticing the temperature. His attention was locked on the worn pages of a paperback book someone had left behind. Its cover was cracked, the spine bent to near collapse, but inside it held something he hadn't found in days: direction. The book was a practical guide for defending oneself in court, meant for law students or junior attorneys, but for Jaden, it became gospel. He read it line by line, sometimes mouthing the words silently, as if tasting the texture of truth on his tongue. The noise of the other inmates, the clanging doors, the gruff voices, all faded beneath the rhythm of his mind working again. In those stolen hours, he was no longer just a defendant. He was a student, a strategist, someone with purpose. There was no mentor, no teacher, no one guiding him. Only discipline, curiosity, and a silent fire that had never really gone out, only been buried beneath years of surviving. He began taking notes on the back of old commissary forms, building arguments in his head, remembering key rulings from cases he'd read years before. For the first time since the arrest, he felt something flicker inside, not hope exactly, but focus. That was stronger. Jaden's motion to represent himself was denied at first. Judge Lang called it a reckless stunt, accusing him of wasting the court's time. But he persisted, filing a formal appeal supported by specific legal citations, ones most young defendants wouldn't even know existed. It was this persistence that caught the attention of Officer Risa McConnell, a veteran bailiff who had seen too many broken men pass through those halls to be easily impressed. But Jaden was different. She noticed how he carried himself, how he asked for paper, how he treated every interaction like it mattered. One evening, as the courtroom emptied and he remained alone with his notes, she quietly approached and asked why he was doing this. He didn't give a speech. He just said, because no one else will. From that night on, she began slipping him case summaries, public files, anything within ethical reach. She didn't break rules, but she bent the silence. Jaden never mistook her help for salvation. He knew better than to trust too deeply. But in Risa, he saw what he'd always looked for, someone who didn't see him as a case number. She never spoke much, but her actions carved space for him to breathe. She reminded him, in her stillness, that not every uniform was the same. Every night, Jaden studied. He practiced arguments aloud, imagined how the judge would interrupt, how the prosecution would dismiss him. He didn't fantasize about winning. He prepared for the worst while fighting for the best. When the court finally granted his right to self-representation, there was no celebration. Just a nod from Risa and a long breath Jaden didn't realize he'd been holding. He wasn't a lawyer yet, but he was no longer defenseless. The fire inside him wasn't for revenge. It was for clarity, for agency. He was tired of being spoken about in courtrooms where he wasn't truly heard. He knew the risks. He knew the odds. But he also knew every flaw in the process that had tried to bury him. He had studied the exact moment the system stopped asking questions and started writing his outcome. Now, he was writing back. And he would not use anger as ink. He would use facts, law, and unshakable resolve. Keep watching, because what Jaden does next will challenge everything you thought one person could do alone. Don't go anywhere. The turning point is just ahead. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that share button and let someone else witness Jaden's fight. The day of the trial arrived with no fanfare, only fluorescent lights humming above a courtroom that had seen too many broken futures to notice one more. Jaden stood alone, wearing the only suit he owned, a second-hand piece Lucille had bought years ago for church, altered to fit his frame with love and a bit of stubborn thread. He carried a folder filled with handwritten notes, highlighted rulings, and outlines he had memorized in the silence of a prison cell. As he approached the defense table, the room seemed to lean against him, heavy with expectation and quiet disbelief. Judge Lang didn't bother hiding her disdain. She began with a tone that dismissed him entirely, her voice clipped, almost annoyed. "Young man, you'll find that real courtrooms are not playgrounds for personal ambition." Jaden didn't flinch. He had practiced that line. He answered calmly, citing procedural law, referencing his approved motion, and requesting the right to make an opening statement. There were chuckles in the gallery, murmurs from the prosecution table. But Jaden spoke anyway. Not for their approval, but because he knew truth wasn't something you needed permission to tell. He laid out the facts with methodical precision, not dramatizing, not begging. Just data, law, logic. He pointed out inconsistencies in the police report. He raised questions about the security footage that was never submitted. He asked why a key witness had not been deposed. Judge Lang interrupted him 3 times. Once to warn him about courtroom conduct. Once to question his source. And once, after he cited a ruling from one of her own previous cases, to tell him he was dangerously close to contempt. Jaden paused. Not because he feared her, but because he respected the law more than she expected. He responded with composure, reaffirming his points, and then, only then, allowed silence to speak for him. That was the moment the courtroom changed. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Risa, standing at the back like a sentry, lowered her gaze and let out the smallest breath, as if she had been holding it for days. Jaden didn't wince or gloat. He moved forward, argument by argument, tearing through assumptions with the sharp edge of preparation. But beneath every sentence, there was weight, years of being unheard, unseen, misjudged. He wasn't just defending himself. He was defending every boy who had never been given the chance to speak their truth. Still, it wasn't easy. Midway through his defense, Jayden stumbled. A procedural objection caught him off guard, one he hadn't anticipated. The judge overruled his motion. For a second, it cracked him. The courtroom blurred, his notes swam, and for the first time, doubt crept in. He looked up at the judge, her face a mask of disinterest, and for a heartbeat, he considered giving up, letting the system do what it always did. But then he saw Lucille. She was seated quietly in the back row, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She didn't look worried. She looked proud. Like she knew her son would find his way through this, because he always had. Jayden took a breath, adjusted his papers, and returned to the stand. He didn't speak louder. He spoke truer. He finished the day stronger than he began, and when court adjourned, the room didn't laugh anymore. They watched. Silently. The judge didn't offer praise, but she didn't stop him either. And sometimes, in rooms like that, silence is the loudest kind of respect. Keep watching. Jayden's next move will challenge not just the court, but everything it thought it understood about power, dignity, and redemption. Inspired by Jayden's strength? Don't just watch. Be part of this journey. Subscribe now and help us share stories that remind the world what true courage looks like. The verdict didn't come with dramatic gasps or a sweeping monologue. It arrived in the form of silence, measured and deliberate, as Judge Lang looked down at the papers before her with a face unreadable even to those who had watched her for years. She cleared her throat, glanced at Jayden, then said what no one in the courtroom had expected. The court finds there is insufficient evidence to proceed. The case is dismissed. Just like that. No applause. No chaos. Just a single breath let out by Jayden, as though he had been underwater for too long and only now found the surface. Risa closed her eyes briefly. Lucille pressed her hand to her mouth, tears tracing a line down one cheek. Judge Lang didn't soften, didn't explain. But Jayden noticed something different, the way her voice had lost its edge, the way she didn't rush to leave the bench. It wasn't approval. It wasn't regret. It was the quiet recognition of a boy who had forced a system to look at him. Truly look, and see not a statistic but a mind, a will, a man. Freedom, however, didn't feel like victory. Jayden walked out of that courtroom not as a hero, but as someone reborn from fire. The world outside hadn't changed. Brighton Falls still moved with the same indifferent rhythm, and injustice still ran thick in the cracks of its sidewalks. But Jayden had changed. He no longer felt invisible. He wasn't just a survivor of the system. He had become its witness and its challenger. Months later, in a packed auditorium, Jayden stood again, not in defense, but in celebration. He was receiving his law degree from Howard University, his name called with thunderous applause. Lucille sat in the front row, dressed in a soft blue suit and trembling with pride. Risa was there too, standing at the back again, still quiet, but smiling. When Jayden took the stage, he didn't raise his fist or shout. He simply looked out over the crowd and said, "Thank you for seeing me." And then he walked off stage, carrying not just a diploma, but the beginning of something far greater than a degree, a purpose. Years passed. Jayden built a reputation not for being the loudest or the most ruthless attorney, but for being relentless in his pursuit of truth. He specialized in defending young people who reminded him of who he used to be. Smart, unheard, cornered by a system that never gave them a fair look. His office was modest. No marble floors or flashy plaques. But on the wall behind his desk hung a single framed page, the opening paragraph of the defense he had written by hand in that holding cell. Below it, a quote he added later, "You are not your circumstance. You are your choices." Sometimes, late in the evening, he'd return to the library in Brighton Falls, now rarely used, and leave law books behind, marked with notes, quotes, and encouragement scribbled in the margins. For those still searching. For those still unseen. And on one particular day, a young girl found one of those books. She sat down in the same back corner where Jayden once studied, her hands tracing the lines he left behind. She didn't know his name yet, but she would. And so the fire continued. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Now share this story with someone who needs to remember that sometimes the quietest voices change the world. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it forward. Someone you know might need this reminder today. And if Jaden's story inspired you, make sure to follow us for more true journeys of resilience.